Good evening, everyone. My name is Maggie, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual event with John B. Judis and conversation with Peter Dreier, who are here to discuss the Socialist Awakening. We're so excited and grateful that our bookstore can continue to bring authors and their works to the community during this time. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the future, and you can learn about them on our website, booksoup.com, as well as our social media at BookSoup. Our next event is Thursday, October 8th at 6 p.m. with Bruce Van Dusen and Art Bell discussing 60 stories about 30 seconds long and constant comedy. For regular updates on upcoming events, please feel free to subscribe to our email newsletter, which you can do on our website. To submit a question during the event, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list you'd like our speakers to answer, please click the like button. We will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Please do not use the sidebar chat to ask a question. Also, support our bookstore and our authors and purchase a copy of tonight's featured book. To do that, just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer's screen. The link will redirect you to our website where you can continue our checkout process. We're also selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro FM and Kobo for those who are interested. A little more about John. John is the editor-at-large at Talking Points Memo and the author of many books, including The Nationalist Revival, Trade, Immigration, and the Revolt Against Globalization, The Populist Explosion, How the Great Recession Transformed American and European Politics, Genesis, Truman, American Jews, and the Origin of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, and The Emerging Democratic Majority, co-written with Rui Teixeira. He has written for numerous publications, including The New Republic, The National Journal, The New York Times Magazine, and The Washington Post Magazine. Born in Chicago, he received his BA and MA degrees in philosophy from the University of California at Berkeley. A little more about Peter. Peter is the E.P. Clapp Distinguished Professor of Politics at Occidental College in Los Angeles. He has spent many years as a journalist, community organizer, government official, and college professor. He writes regularly for the Nation, American Prospect, Talking Points Memo, Dissent, and other publications. His latest book is We Own the Future, Democratic Socialism, American Style, which you can request to buy through BookSoup. His next book, Baseball Rebels, How Reformers and Radicals Shook Up the Game and Changed America, will be coming out soon. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to John and Peter. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie. John, it's great to see you.
Great to see you again.
I'm a big fan, as you know, for many years, and we've intersected in many ways over many years. And I'm glad that I was asked to talk about, or to ask you about, your new book, The Socialist Awakening, which I thought was amazing that in 125 pages you packed in the history of socialism, the future of socialism, and the present of socialism, and how we came to socialism. So readers are in for a great treat when they order and read your book. So why don't we get started, John, and I'll ask you a pretty basic question, which is, how did you come to write the book? What did you hope to accomplish?
Okay, I'll say a little about this, and I want to thank Vromans and BookSoup for hosting me, and I urge all of you to support independent booksellers. They're becoming a rare species around America. I became a socialist sometime in the 1960s, late 1960s. I only realized later that my own childhood had something to do with it, which is to say that I was born into wealth. I lived in a very fancy apartment building. Upstairs, directly above us, was the Pritzker family. So that'll give you an idea. But then my parents lost all their money when I was a teenager. Their life fell apart. I was a scholarship student at college. And I saw something about the ravages of capitalism and what it could do to people. But it was only later, really, that I put it together. When I was a socialist in the late 60s, early 70s, a member of a group called New American Movement, which eventually merged to form Democratic Socialists of America. The kind of socialism that I thought of then was pretty much derived from Karl Marx and the experience of the Socialist Party and Eugene Debs in America. It was the idea that we would somehow have a society where workers, and either through the government or through unions, would control all the industry. There wouldn't be a capitalist class anymore. There wouldn't be a free market, and that it would be democratic. So it was sort of an idea in some ways of the Soviet Union, but democratic. A democratic. What would happen if you really had real democracy in those countries? By the mid-1970s, that idea was very foggy, and I just couldn't put it together with the reality in America that I was seeing. And from that time until, let's say, the end of the Soviet Union, early 90s, I really thought of myself simply as a progressive or a liberal. But under the influence of a fellow named Marty Sklar and various other thinkers, I began to rethink what socialism meant. And what I came to believe was that socialism was not necessarily some kind of stage in history that came after capitalism and that had to be punctuated by a revolution, but it was something that could happen within capitalism itself, the way that capitalism had developed within feudalism. And you could have socialist institutions and a socialist and a more equitable society within capitalism itself. That was a big change. It was also a change that a guy in Vermont who went from Chicago to Vermont, just like I went from the East Coast to Berkeley in the early 60s, was coming upon. Bernie Sanders. 1989, 1990, he changes from being a Debsian socialist to what he called a Swedish-style socialist. But I have to say that for me, it was mostly theory and analysis. It was how to understand capitalism, and I could say, to my cat or at the, some privately to my people, yeah, we have some kind of socialism within capitalism. But it really wasn't until the Sanders campaign in 2015 and 2016 that I awoke to the idea that socialism could actually be a practical politics, that it could have a life in America. I mean, we just did not, even in our wildest fantasies in the early 70s, think that anything like that could happen. So really, it was the Sanders campaign that did it for me and made me think again seriously about what socialism is, whether you could have a socialist movement in America, and what form it would take.
So, John, I'm reading a tweet from Donald Trump. The Democratic Party is now the party of socialism. Biden and Sanders, they both want the government to nationalize your health care, silence your speech, confiscate your guns, regulate your industry, indoctrinate your children. Right? So Donald Trump just spent 3 days in a socialized medicine hospital, Walter Reed, and yet I'm sure he doesn't think of it that way, right? So that leads me to sort of two questions. One is, Trump is calling Biden and the whole Democratic Party socialist, which is sort of typical of the kind of red baiting that the Republicans have been doing since Joe McCarthy or even before that. But is he partly right? Is he partly right that Biden and the whole Democratic Party have embraced, without calling it socialism, have embraced something that you might call socialism? And secondly, and I don't mean this just to be snarky, I think a good example of your theory about, it was actually Eduard Bernstein's theory that you've adopted in your book, that socialism can happen within capitalism. Isn't the Veterans Administration and Walter Reed Hospital, aren't those good examples of what you're talking about?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I've been sort of reluctant to write an op-ed about Biden and socialism because I'm afraid I'll give ammunition to the enemy. Let me just go back a minute to the early 2000s. What happens in the country in the early 2000s is that we get a Great Recession. And among a whole generation of people who weren't raised in the Cold War, who didn't identify socialism with the Soviet Union, you suddenly get this extremely favorable, very surprisingly favorable view of socialism. I think it's the same as what happened to me 40 years before, which is to say that kids, if I can use that, I'm Sanders' age, began to be skeptical about capitalism and what capitalism was bringing to them. And what they thought of as capitalism was what had been going on, let's say, since 1980 in America. And what was the alternative to that? Socialism. Socialism for them, again, meant a change in the distribution of income, more equality, more power for workers in the workplaces, some kind of public financing so rich people couldn't control elections. The environment was very important because I think climate change for this new generation that was growing up in the 80s, 90s, early 21st century was like nuclear war was for us in the 50s. It was very scary in a way that it really isn't. I'm sorry to say for me, it's more again, it's more an issue, but I think it had an immediacy. And again, that's an area where capitalism seemed to be failing and where we need some kind of public intercession. So again, we've got this kind of new idea of socialism, which has which conforms very much to the idea that Sanders began to have in the early 1990s, and that some socialist theorists, former Marxist theorists, also began to have. But there are many politicians. Let's take Elizabeth Warren, for instance. I'll get to Biden after her. Really, I don't think there was a dime's worth of difference between Warren and Sanders, or Sherrod Brown and Sanders, or the members of the Progressive Caucus in the House, which they number 95, I think is the number now, and Sanders. Very similar. Again, some kind of public control of healthcare, more public intercession in energy, transportation, in industries that just weren't doing the job on their own, deregulated. So again, you have this kind of shadow socialism. People who have to run for office, let's say as a senator in Massachusetts. There's many people in that state who are over 40 years old who still identify socialism with the Soviet Union. So for them, it would be politically unwise for them to call themselves socialists. So I think, again, it was understandable that Warren took that position. But again, I think it would be accurate to say that she is a kind of shadow socialist. Now, Biden, I think, comes really from more of the center of the Democratic Party in many respects. Championed a bankruptcy bill that would make it harder for poor people to get out of debt. But under the influence, again, of what's happening in the Democratic Party, among what's happening with young people and the kind of choices that we face now in the country, where we're going to have big government. It's a question of how it works, whether it's left or right, has adopted policies, again, that are very close to Warren and Sanders. Public option for health care, promote unions, redistribution of income, economic patriotism, so discourage companies from moving overseas to get away from paying American workers wages and following regulations. So Biden's not a socialist again, but in this sense, the Democratic Party is moving in this kind of socialist direction.
So in your book, you raised the question of whether there's anybody on the national stage that can replace Bernie Sanders now that he's not going to run for president again. He's still a force to be reckoned with in the Senate, but Ocasio-Cortez is 30 years old and has a national following. One of my students told me that she has like 7 million followers or something on Twitter. Some outrageous number like that. But socialism isn't just a cult of personality. Socialism is a movement, or it's a set of ideas. So how do we move from, the public opinion polls that show that 40 Gallup had a poll earlier this year, 40% of all Americans say they prefer socialism over capitalism. They probably don't know what it means, but that's what they say. And then young people, it's even more, right? But it's also about building a movement, and you talk a bit about that in the book. So what's socialism like post Sanders in America?
Well, the big problem that the existing socialists have, and that people on the left in the Democratic Party have, is that there's a huge social and cultural divide in the country. And it's that divide that Trump has entered into, and what should be familiar by now. It's the big metro areas, the post-industrial cities, the coast, Chicago, what have you, the college towns. On one hand, small town America, middle-sized America, Mansfield, Ohio, Evansville, Indiana, places like that. And if you want to have a movement of the left, let's say it's not called socialism, but that it has those principles: people before profits, egalitarian, institutions that don't work to the people's advantage, taken over if necessary. You're going to have to unite those parts of the country. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez comes from a gentrified part of Queens, the Bronx, combination of minorities, gentrified professionals. That's not characteristic of a lot of Midwestern towns. So really what we're looking for is the development, again, I would hope it would come within the Democratic Party, of a leadership that can unite these parts of the country. I mean, Bill Clinton had some of that in 1992. It wasn't on behalf of these politics necessarily, but, we used to say about Clinton that he could combine Little Rock and New Haven, or even Little Rock and Oxford. I think that that's, again, the kind of politics that we have to develop, but it's not here yet. And I would see Biden at this point as a kind of placeholder, as somebody, I think he's going to have an enormously difficult time if he's elected, and God help us if he's not, but he'll have an enormously difficult time putting it together. And the kind of leadership that I would see is in the future. It's in the towards the I would hope towards the end of the next decade.
So Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal from Seattle, co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, she's coming to speak to my class on Thursday remotely, because we're reading her new autobiography called Use the Power That You Have. And, she doesn't call herself a socialist, but it's kind of like what you were saying about Elizabeth Warren. Almost everything that she talks about, you could call socialism in your definition of socialism. And the Progressive Caucus in the House is about 100 people.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what you're talking about. So why bother calling it socialism if what's important are the results? Well, if it's a public option or Medicare for all, who cares whether it's called socialism? If it's affordable housing for everybody and paid family leave and all the things you were talking about before, the Green New Deal, why waste our time, some might say, trying to get into an argument about socialism when it's really, something that Americans believe in? It's like Obamacare. People liked Obamacare if you described it. If you called it Obamacare, a lot of people didn't like it.
Right. Well, a few things. First thing is that the generations that are coming up now, let's say the people who are between 18 and 40 years old, don't have the same kind of problems or barriers toward that idea of socialism that we had when we were growing up. It's simply the environment has changed. Still, from my standpoint, maybe there'll be a different word, but what socialism provides is a kind of comprehensive vision that involves ethics as well as politics and economics. The term social is very important. When I would interview Sanders voters and Warren voters too, and ask them, well, what do you think of as socialism? They talk about some issues, but they talk about cooperation. That'd be very important versus competition. It all goes back to, again, 19th century Christian socialism, and the Jewish Reform socialism was the same way in the social gospel. I think that that's an element that socialism brings. Whether in the end it is the unifying vision, I can't say, but I think that's the promise of socialism as a politics. But I would agree with you to insist that somebody, call themselves a socialist when they advocate all these things is silly at this point.
So let's get to that. The largest socialist organization in the last 100 years, since the demise of the Socialist Party as a mass party back in the early 1900s, is the Democratic Socialists of America. And I was one of the founding members. I was like you, I was in NAM, and then we merged with Michael Harrington's group, and it became DSA. And I was on the original board, executive committee, whatever we called it back in the 80s. And none of us would have believed back then in the 80s there'd be 70,000 members of this organization. It's still tiny compared to the Sierra Club or any other sort of mass organization, but it's pretty amazing given what we were thinking of back in the 70s and 80s. And they recently, the DSA leadership basically passed a resolution prohibiting their local chapters around the country from endorsing anybody that didn't call themselves a socialist, including Joe Biden. So that's a kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, sectarianism or purism.
Did they really do that? I mean, I'm now a member, so I get all their bulletins. I never heard that. They debated that at the convention in 2019 and didn't agree to that.
They said they could not endorse Biden.
Oh yeah, no, that goes without saying. We can just stop it there. I'm just not sure about that, Peter, about whether they went to that extreme. But I in my experience, I would draw a distinction between the leadership, the official leadership of DSA, and a lot of their elected officials. People like my elected official, Vaughn Stewart, who's a state assemblyman and represents my county, who have to deal with we could say ordinary Americans, and don't exist in a kind of bubble. I think the problem with certain parts of DSA and with its leadership is that it really does represent a very kind of narrow socio-cultural view. And I two examples. One would be the refusal to endorse Biden. I mean, from my standpoint, if you're trying to develop a large mass politics in America that's on the left, you have to swim in that sea. And that sea is populated by people who are now going to vote for Biden. So there's no reason to dissociate yourself from them that I can see, unless you think that somehow you're going to have a group that doesn't represent any part of what these, this enormous mass of people who are going to vote for Biden believes in. The second example I would say would be the abolish the police. I get these things that we're going to have a meeting about abolishing police in prisons in the DC Metro chapter. And I think that's just nuts. I think, again, that's the kind of politics that might appeal in a few zip codes in America and college towns. And, and again, I'm not, I entirely support the idea of reforming the police. And I know that there are certain cities where you really, the process of reform has to be a process really of upheaval. But to present that as a national demand, to people who were, worried about having their houses burglarized, their cars stolen, want to call 9/11 if something happened, is just nutty. And it represents, again, a kind of socio-cultural isolation that I think will, undermine the left and make it more of a cult than a political organization.
And, we're in the middle of a huge uprising of people protesting police brutality and police racism and racial profiling. Hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. But you don't hear people talking about a socialist view of the criminal justice system. Right?
Well, you do see, I'm confined to quarters here. This damn pandemic. I'm a journalist by my profession, and if it were normal times, I would have gone to Minneapolis, wherever, Seattle, Portland, and talked to people. So I'm relying on secondhand videos and things like that. But you see people talking about, again, the system, just the way you saw it in the Occupy movement. So there is some sense of a larger system. But I think accompanying that and accompanying the completely legitimate protest against the police brutality that exists, the Floyd, what have you, is just some. Put it in a stark terms. It's kids that have been penned up in their homes for months and months. I think that there's a way in which the country itself is getting a little nutty and crazy, and it's expressed in anger, frustration. I think that that's an element of those protests, and it's also an element that if Trump had not turned into such a crazy man himself, he might have really taken advantage of. But I thought when Minneapolis was happening that it was going to be a real disaster for Biden, and then right afterwards Trump does his protests, where he shoves peaceful protesters out of the way and gasses them so he can do his stunt in front of a church holding up a Bible. So that again, he completely nullified whatever advantage he could have gotten out of it. Just as incidentally, he just did today with the Pelosi Schumer thing. I was very worried that that Pelosi was going to get blamed for no pandemic relief for holding it up in order to do 3 trillion rather than 1.5 trillion. But Trump came through for us today. He completely took responsibility for having no relief bill. So again, he's an asset, but I think he also makes people a little crazy, and he makes people think, well, we have to not just reform the police, we have to defund the police. It's not just a matter of having normal security on the border, but instead of this crazy wall, we have to have open borders. So he's driven people a little nutty.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. So your idea that that it's really a question of generations and demographics, that when the baby boom generation starts to die off, and the current younger people between 18 and 40 become the dominant force in American politics, that they will be more open either to socialist ideas called socialism or socialist ideas called something else. And in Chicago right now, there are 6 identified socialist DSA members who were in the city council. Right. And in a bunch of states like in Virginia and Maryland, there's some socialists that are in the state legislature. There's kind of a farm team developing of young people running for office. Right. Who might be, moving up the ladder over the next 15 or 20 years. But what does it mean to have, as a Chicagoan, what does it mean to have 6 DSA members on the 50-member Chicago Board of Aldermen, which is what they call their city council?
I can't tell you. I'm stuck here in Silver Spring. I can't follow Chicago politics that well to tell you. I think you'd have to ask somebody from Chicago, that question.
Well, what does it mean to have somebody in Maryland in the legislature or in the county?
Vaughn Stewart does good stuff. I mean, you would think Maryland is not a poor state, but we have a completely screwed up public sector. It's our vote by mail system. I registered to vote by mail, and I got my link to a ballot, and it doesn't work. Unemployment insurance, people are having a hard time getting it. So, I mean, he's been very good at dramatizing those kind of issues. Mm-hmm. And that's there's somebody in Virginia who's also done a lot of valuable work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, John, part of your book, you've got a chapter on Corbyn and
right.
Britain, and the beginning of your book, you say that that this pandemic has driven the last nail in the coffin of the belief in free enterprise and the market, but that it's growing in the United States, but it's dying in Britain. And is that because of something structural about the two countries, or is it just a matter
which is growing? The belief in free enterprise?
Socialism is growing in America. Belief in socialism.
By comparison, there's much. Britain is a country with a party that is nominally socialist. They're way, way, way ahead of us. In my book, I was trying to explain why Corbyn had done so poorly. Right. And I was very pessimistic about Keith Starmer, who was taking his place, because Starmer had been the leader of this idea that there had to be a people's referendum on Brexit. Mm-hmm. I hope I looked at some of the people who are our audience. I can't see you to see whether you know what I'm talking about. But the idea was that the Starmer and part of the Labour Party wanted there to be a second referendum to see whether people really wanted to leave the European Union or not. And this contributed to incredible confusion within the Labour Party about what they stood for. And they really lost a lot of their older base, which may not have meant losing a majority of their members, but it meant losing many of the districts. Mm-hmm. So what I argued in the book was that that the Labour Party had failed to come to terms with British nationalism and with the British pride in its own accomplishments, and that Brexit itself had been based not on some kind of imperial fantasies, but on the fact that after World War II, Britain pulled itself together and created industries that made them, by the 1950s, the export leader in Europe. And also, to astonishment, I didn't really know this, they ended up becoming self-sufficient in agriculture, which they hadn't been since, 1846. Mm-hmm. And so there was, like there is in America, a kind of buy British, that we used to do these things. And a lot of Brexit was based upon that. And the Labour Party, in abandoning that, was abandoning the left behinds of Britain. Now, Starmer, it turns out, has recognized what the problem is. I'm much more optimistic about where the Labour Party is going now.
And you talk in the book about the importance of borders and boundaries, and that you're critical of people that want to have open borders, the sort of the left wing of American politics. And you, and in part of your book, you talk about the importance of patriotism. That socialists need to be patriotic. And what you didn't say in the book, I wish you'd added this, maybe the second edition, you will, is the Star Spangled Banner was written by a socialist, and America the Beautiful was written by a socialist.
Yeah, Pledge of Allegiance also.
Yeah, the Pledge of Allegiance also. And not the Star Spangled Banner. I meant the Pledge of Allegiance, Francis Bellamy. And Catherine Lee Bates who was a lesbian and a socialist and a radical. she wrote America the Beautiful, and Woody Guthrie, socialist / communist, wrote what should be the national anthem, "This Land Is Your Land." So, a lot of people, like Howard Zinn used to say, that patriotism is the opposite of radicalism or socialism, that we have to be internationalists if we're going to be truly humanitarians and egalitarians. Right. How do you disagree with that?
Well, look, I think that we have to be internationalists in some kinds of issues. For instance, climate change can't be dealt with by the United States alone. Foreign conflicts, nuclear proliferation, I could name, 50 different kinds of issues that have to be dealt with internationally. But our democracy itself is based upon the sense of common citizenship among Americans. Our welfare state is based on that. When I pay my taxes in Maryland, I have to be able to accept that those taxes are going to go for welfare payments for somebody in Orlando, Florida that I'll never meet, never know, and really have no idea about. And I'm willing to do that because they're also Americans. If, say, they were going to go to somebody in Turkey or Brazil, I might have some doubts about that. Now, that seems like a stupid point, but it's relevant when you get, for instance, Democratic candidates saying, well, we're going to have Medicare for all, and anybody who's in the country is going to be able to enjoy this, which is not, incidentally, the case in Canada. You have to be, in some sense, an official resident. You have to have a card in order to enjoy their health care system. So I think we have to have a common sense of citizenship. And when people start talking about open borders, really what's lost in that is this sense of what it is to be an American. So that's really what I'm talking about.
So if are you saying, John, that you think that undocumented immigrants shouldn't?
No, you know what I'm saying? Look, I always said this, and I think, again, this is a way in which Trump has made people crazy.
Yeah.
I'm entirely for a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. Yeah. As it stands, we have like 11, 12 million people who are adrift in the country, who are subject to all kinds of exploitation and hardship. Again, we have to end that. But we also have to have borders. And we have to have laws that say that those borders are going to be enforced. We don't need to have a wall to do that, $1 billion wall. We can, for instance, require employers to use checks in order to find out whether the people they're hiring are legal. So again, I think that what's happened to the Democrats is that they simply just left out that part of the equation. It's both things. It's path to citizenship and also borders. So that's been my position, and that was historically, again, that was the Clinton position. I think that's fair to say that was Obama's position.
But in the meantime, the 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, if the Congress passed a Medicare for all bill or a public option, should undocumented immigrants be able to participate in that?
Look, that's a thorny issue. And, I think that you have to couple the two. I think you have to couple immigration reform with different kinds of social welfare reform. And I think unless you do that, you're going to have an outcry from people exactly along those lines. Why are we supporting these people who aren't even citizens? So I think that those two have to go together. And, there's a sense in which we're finding out in this period, lo and behold, that there are these enormous constitutional obstacles to social reform in America. The Electoral College, the Supreme Court, originally the Supreme Court didn't have judicial review, and it doesn't have judicial review in a lot of European countries. It can't knock out legislation. The parliaments have the final say. Again, we're in a situation where the most representative part of our government, the House of Representatives, has less and less power as the years go by, and more power is vested in the Senate and in the president, who are elected on a less representative ballot.
Yep. Okay. So, John, I want to return to my first question or second question about Walter Reed Hospital being a version of socialized medicine or the VA, and in reference to something you say in your book, where you talk a lot about socialism within capitalism.
Yeah.
I wrote an article, I don't know, 1980 or something, called Socialist Incubators.
Yeah.
Sort of, there were like worker-owned plywood mills up in Oregon. Oh, this is an example of an incubator. So what are some examples of what you're talking about? Some real concrete examples where you can say to people, is it the public schools? Is it the fire department? Is it the national parks? Are those examples of socialism in capitalism?
Well, you'd have to just think of what it was like in the 19th century, let's say right after the Civil War, and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and what has happened since then to give workers more power over their destiny and over their country. And all those things, the unions, the New Deal reforms, especially particularly the Second New Deal, progressive taxation, Social Security, the collective bargaining, all those kinds of things are elements of socialism that are introduced into capitalism. Now, the sad fact is that they can get unintroduced too. They can get knocked out. So the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 has just gotten totally eaten away and really doesn't, an act which was supposed to facilitate collective bargaining no longer does. So again, we've been moving in that direction. Walter Reed, absolutely. National Institute of Health, again, an area that if you left it simply to firms and their R&D, you wouldn't get these miracle drugs. What you do get is them taking them, the research from NIH and places like that and making these enormous profits. And that's why, there either has to be very strict regulation or takeover of those kind of companies. So let me just say one other thing. I think I argued this in the book, and I got it. I was influenced very much by Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation, where he talks about the late 1920s and early 1930s as this pivotal time in American and European history, where at that point, the old rules of capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, the gold standard had all come a cropper, and you had this massive depression. And the countries went in two very different directions. In both cases, big government. But on the one hand, you get Central Europe and Southern Europe fascism, big government of the right. And on the other hand, you get in the United States, you get Roosevelt, you get big government, you get it coming from the left. We're at a kind of moment like that. I don't think that Trump has it together. He's not, Hitler had almost 1 million men under arms himself, separate from the army itself. And he had the support of a lot of business and military against the left because they were very scared of the left. Trump doesn't have that. He's an eccentric. But I think we are going to face a time when...
You got the Proud Boys.
Yes, he's got the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys are not going to do it. And he does not have the military. Again, but I think we are at a similar fork in the road. And if you look at some of the Republicans like Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, they're now talking about industrial policy. I mean, they are talking about a big government, but it would be, again, more from the right. It would be less encouragement of unions. Taxation would be more with a view towards subsidizing business than subsidizing people to buy things, buy necessities. So, again, we're at this kind of fork in the road.
So there's no social democracy in the world. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, most of Western Europe, that has been able to get the kinds of things you're talking about, kind of the welfare state, workers' rights, women's rights, and so forth, environmental regulations, without a strong labor movement. And sort of the key missing ingredient in the United States is that only 10% of all American workers are in unions. Now, the Gallup poll just came out and said that 65% of Americans support unions, but as you just said, the labor laws are so out of date and so pro-business that it's very difficult for workers to unionize.
I'll tell you something funny too about those polls. If you go back in the 40s and 50s, you won't find 60% in favor. You'll find, maybe 40% because people were scared because they really had real power at that point.
Yeah.
So, they seem fine now because they're not as effective as they once were. And I absolutely agree with the point you're making about them.
Well, say a little more about that, though. How do we build a progressive, social democratic socialist movement without a powerful labor movement?
Talking about whether the movement's going to be socialist or not, or whether there's going to be something called a labor movement, what form it takes, again, is I think something that's really up in the air. But it's very hard to imagine a movement on the left without an organized power among workers. It's whether it's going to come through the growth of the AFL-CIO or some other form is still unclear. If you look at where the greatest support for socialism is coming from, I broke down these polls because the people from Data for Progress and YouGov gave me the data, and then they gave me these little gadgets that allowed me to make tabulations of them, cross tabulations. And the heaviest concentration of support for socialism, for people who say, I am a socialist, comes from kids. Again, we're talking about the young, slightly more male than female, went to college and graduated, but not graduate student or anything like that. It's the kids who are lost in capitalism, who again expected much more in the early 2000s and found themselves instead facing a great recession, this enormous amount of student debt. They didn't have these kind of professional niches that they could go into because they didn't have PhDs or law degrees. So that's the thing. And that's not, again, a group that for the most part is going into unions. It's how, again, and a lot of them end up as Uber drivers and things like that. There is a process, as you know, of discontent and organization, and I don't know where it's going to go. But unless it goes somewhere, it's going to be very hard to have a functioning left. And you'll elect somebody like Obama, and the main organized pressure to him came, as it stands, from the Tea Party and the Koch brothers and people on the right. So yes, we have to have that. I don't have the recipe for how to do it.
Well, if Biden wins, the Democrats take back both houses of Congress. There are various forms of labor law reform that everybody's talking about. Biden, probably more than any president since maybe Truman, has been talking about strengthening labor laws and making it easier for workers.
He's very good on that. That's he's actually, I'd say he's as good as Sanders on the union side. Yeah. And he had a lot of support from unions in the election itself. Right. And it's very important to do that. But again, you're going to have to put the fire under the Democrats. We had a situation in 1976 when Jimmy Carter was elected, and he had just about, veto-proof majorities in both houses, and he couldn't get it because the Democrats, at the last moment, too many Democrats jumped ship under pressure from the Business Roundtable, Chamber of Commerce. So again, I think this goes back to the previous point we were talking about. There has to be a lot of pressure from the left, and a lot of people doing tweets is not going to do it. It's very important for getting people aroused and stuff like that, but it's not necessarily going to make great changes like we need.
The most progressive, large-scale unions in the country right now are the teachers and the nurses.
Right.
So these are examples of college graduates who are not into business, but they're in the sort of mid-level professions making middle-class incomes, but not, and they're doing okay, and they're not doing great, right? And I'm wondering if if it's possible to imagine that the labor movement would grow to, if it doubled to 20% in the next 15 or 10 years, let's say, what difference that would make in our politics. If the Congress passes a labor law reform bill, it makes it easier to unionize. The labor movement gets its act together, takes advantage of that, and starts to organize Walmart workers, janitors, people in fast foods, the Fight for 15 group. Mm-hmm. What will that mean for American? These are not explicitly socialists, but they're the kinds of people who need more compassionate government.
Well, it would mean a lot, and you can look at the converse. You can look at what happened in Wisconsin when the Scott Walker was able to basically destroy the public workers in that state, and what that meant in terms of elections, and how difficult it has become to elect Democrats in Wisconsin. So, politically, it would have tremendous repercussions. Again, the question would be regional too. Could the South, what happens to the South? A lot of the decline of the labor movement came because it failed after World War II to organize in the South. And again, you face racial divisions there. You face a tradition of being a kind of outlet for Northern business to find lower wages and so on. So yeah, it's important, and it's important for unifying the country. I mean, that's why, again, that's why you could take something like the white working class, which is now the bête noire of American politics, the people that Trump thinks he can count upon. Well, a lot of those people were unionized in after World War II, and they voted for Democrats. So it's all right. It's very important. It's just that it's not clear how it's going to happen. And I think that the labor law reform, government facilitating things is a very important part of it.
When we were budding radicals in the 60s and 70s, we all read Marx, right? We had study groups, reading groups. We went through the first 3 volumes of Capital and so forth. It was, in retrospect, it was a little nutso. It's a little cultish, right? My impression is that among the young people that call themselves socialists, that they don't even think it's necessary to understand Marx or Marxism. As you said earlier, their view of socialism is more about Scandinavia, Denmark, Sweden, maybe even Canada. So Marxism and Marx kind of no longer part of the equation. Is that there was he had a nice run for 200 years and now it's over?
I think Marx is absolutely essential to understanding capitalism. But again, from an analytical standpoint, from a standpoint of understanding politics and where we're going in the country and what kind of society we can create, I think that he fosters certain kinds of illusions and has done so for a century. Mm-hmm. End of markets, no money, so on and so forth. That there would be a growing industrial working class that would suffer immiseration. It would organize in the face of that, and as the crises come, it would grow and grow until there was a revolution, and then we'd have socialism. So that part of it is, but the understanding of socialism as relations, a production of history itself as having stages. Again, it's essential, but among a lot of the young, and we're not talking about DSA members. We're talking about, again, the kids who say I have a favorable view. Not important. I quote in the book somebody from the Young Democratic Socialists of America, the youth wing of it in Oregon, who told an interviewer that she doesn't identify with, quote, the economic part, unquote, of democratic socialism, but with the emphasis on community bonds, and that she doesn't want to read Marx, who she fears would ruin democratic socialism for her. Now that's maybe not typical, but for many people, they wouldn't even think about reading Marx one way or the other. So no, not essential, but if you're an intellectual, essential.
What books influenced you as a young person, and what books do you think are influencing this generation of radicals and socialists?
Well, I'm not sure about now. Jacobin is very important, and Bhaskar Sankara. I mean, you know who he is. He started. I mean, I know you who know who he is, Peter. I'm sort of speaking to our invisible audience here. He was an undergraduate at George Washington and started Jacobin, this magazine, out of his dorm room in 2010 or 2011. And it now has about 50,000 circulation as a magazine, plus a million people who look at it on the web. And I think that it's very influential. A lot of the stuff he publishes I don't agree with, but he's also pretty non-sectarian in terms of the kinds of things he prints and publish. So that would be one. I think a lot of people read that. I think they read the other publications like Current Affairs, The Nation, In These Times, my old publication. Books, I'm not sure of. I don't know what books people are reading, and I hope they read mine, and I hope they read yours. But that's right.
The book that most of my students that are kind of on the left, I think they've all read, is The New Jim Crow. About mass incarceration. And I think a lot of them are very much taken with Angela Davis.
Is that right?
Her ideas about the prison industrial complex, which is where you get the, defund the police and end all prisons. They may not agree with everything she says. She's a pretty hardcore Marxist, but her books don't smell that way, basically. And when we were growing up, I think it was Michael Harrington's The Other America, right?
Right.
And
that would be the counterpart.
The Power Elite by C. Wright Mills, which were more about
Mills was really important. He was. I guess the people who are important to me were people like Paul Goodman, who most people have not even heard of now. Growing Up Absurd. Yeah. He was something of a male chauvinist. He always talked about boys and not girls. But he gave people like me a sense of why we felt alienated in the society and what could be done about it. I only started reading Marx, in the late 1960s. The great book is Capital Volume 1, and if you really want to read Marx, and that's one of the few books that he actually published in his lifetime, along with the Communist Manifesto, and a lot of the other stuff is published afterwards. So all available at the bookstores, right?
Well, let me end with this kind of question. You can't be a radical, a progressive, or a socialist unless you're hopeful, right? There's a lot of pessimism in America.
Yeah.
On the left, I have a lot of radical professor colleagues who wouldn't know a picket line if they fell over it, right? And probably don't even know who their congressperson is. They talk about how bad capitalism is. And I think that's pedagogical malfeasance. But I try to see that my students have a sense of possibility and hope. That's why I've asked Congresswoman Jayapal to speak to my class in a couple of days. What's your sense of that, about whether people are saying that this generation is cynical and pessimistic, but my sense is, at least the ones that I know that are activists, they're kind of hopeful. It's kind of refreshing. They believe, they're worried about climate change. There's a part of them that's apocalyptic in that way, but they also are digging in for the long haul. And I'm very impressed how unideological they are. They want to change things.
I don't have enough contact with younger generation. But I mean, the word I would use would be worried. I mean, you use that yourself in describing how people think about climate change, but I think they're worried about the future, and particularly now. I went in during the late 1969, we started a journal called Socialist Revolution, believe it or not. And Jim O'Connor, the economist, used to call me the little black cloud because I thought it would take maybe 15 years for us to have a revolution. At the time, people really thought that it was going to be 5 years, 10 years. So my reputation has always been as a pessimist.
But I don't see that among young activists today. I don't see.
You would know that better than I would too. I mean, you're a college professor. You see,
I'll make a statement. I'm very impressed that they don't think that there'll be some kind of revolution on Wednesday and socialism on Thursday. They actually do believe in the long haul. Our generation read a book by Andre Gortz called Strategy for Labor, which was about what he called non-reformist reforms, which you talk about as socialism within capitalism, building strength in institutions and then gaining momentum. And I think that's what this generation brings. It's so much smarter and more pragmatic than the new left generation of the 60s. I don't know if you share that view or not.
I share that view, but you know it much better than I do. I'm sitting here in Montgomery County in my in my little cage, stuck.
Okay. So, John, are there any final thoughts you want to leave us with about the book and what you sought to accomplish by writing it, and what you hope for?
Well, I think the final thing I'd say about the book is that my earlier book, especially the populism book, was more of an analytical description of what was happening. This book is more of an argument, and it contains more of what I think should happen. And what I particularly again want to stress is the importance of bringing together the different parts of the country. That you can't build a movement just out of, let's say, greater Brooklyn and greater Chicago and San Francisco and whatever, that we really do have to bring together all these parts of the country. And we have to think about how that's going to be done and what the common ground on which to erect a movement like that.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, John. And
thank you, Peter, and thank you, bookstores.
And I have to say that the same number of people who were on the call an hour and a half ago, hour and 10 minutes ago, are still on it. So you kept people interested, John. So good for you. Mag, you want to take us out?
Yes, thank you. This is a wrap on our presentation. Thank you so much to our guests and to all of you who tuned in this evening. We greatly appreciate everyone's time and your support of independent bookstores. Please purchase a copy of The Socialist Awakening by clicking the green button at the bottom of your screen. We're also accepting donations on our website. If you'd like regular updates on our upcoming events, make sure to follow us on Crowdcast and subscribe to our newsletter. Have a great evening and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.